So who here likes to watch sports? I like to watch sports. Got a few of you out there. So this is a good week for you. There's some really good games coming up this week. Thanksgiving holiday. There's always a lot of special things going on with that. I've not been a real avid sports watcher in my life. I would say I'm kind of casual at that. But this fall, I got really into volleyball. And the reason I got really into volleyball is because my daughter Hannah started playing volleyball on the Lebanon area homeschool Rockets high school team. And so we went to games and we watched her, and it was super fun. And so she's a junior, but this is her first year playing, but she actually got to be the starting server position for every game. And that may not sound like a big deal to you, but if you know how unathletic my wife and I were, that's a big deal, right? Like, we're like, it's a miracle, right? And we just went, and, she was really consistent and coordinated and totally not clumsy, and we have no idea how that happened. But I enjoyed it. Man, we just loved watching Hannah serve, and after the last game, a family friend whose granddaughters were actually on the team as well came over to me and said, man, hasn't this been fun watching these girls play together? I was like, yeah, I love it. He says, doesn't it make you want to play? I'm like, absolutely not. Like, anything to do with a ball and coordination to me, not a good idea, right? So just because I loved watching Hannah serve, it did not translate for me wanting to serve myself. And I think really, as I think about my life and just life in general, that can be true in a lot of ways. Again, we're glad you're here today. We're glad you're here and enjoying the worship, and we're glad you got to hear the kids sing, and we're glad that you got to hear Dennis share with us about what they're doing in Cameroon. And maybe you're here because you love the music, or maybe you're here because you like the messages, and you're here and you're enjoying it, and we're glad you're here. Right now we're in the middle of this series on evangelism, which is the practice of us sharing our faith with Jesus with others. And, maybe you love hearing those upside down lives turned right side up testimonies, and you just can't get enough of that. Or maybe you love hearing about people who went in courageous ways and reached people who are far from God and saw miraculous things. And, man, you just cannot get enough of those stories. But again, for me and maybe for you, we love that, but it doesn't always make it easier for us to step out and do that ourselves. Maybe we wish we could, but maybe there's some things that hold you back. Maybe you feel like you don't have a good enough grasp of the Bible, and so you don't know how you would share that. Or maybe you think about your testimony and your story of coming to Christ, and you're like, it's not that interesting, not like those stories you hear people share, and so I don't know that that's something I could share. Or maybe you really want to share with people, but you just don't know how. You just don't have the words or the process to do that. And so here's the thing, whether it's volleyball or evangelism, we have to have a paradigm shift, a change in thinking in order for us to get involved. There's a barrier for us that we have to step across. This is Lord Kelvin. We're going to show you. He was a 19th century physicist, did a lot of really cool things, worked in thermodynamics, which if you don't know what that is, I'm not going to explain it right now. But he's probably most famous for being the guy who discovered the temperature at which all molecules stop moving, and we call that absolute zero. And so because of that, the scientific scale, we do Fahrenheit, other countries do Celsius. If you're in science, you talk about temperature in kelvins because of Lord Kelvin, because he figured that out. And at the end of his career, towards the end of the 19th century, about the turn of the 20th century, he famously said this: "There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement." He said, we've done that, been there, figured it out. There's a problem, though, because 5 years after he said that, this guy came on the scene. And he introduced quantum mechanics and special relativity and E equals MC squared, and he blew everybody's mind. And suddenly they're like, physics isn't what we thought it was. And so everything was new and everything changed. He had to have a paradigm shift, Lord Kelvin did, in order to catch up and keep moving. He was wrong. He had to think differently. And so because of us today, thinking about evangelism, maybe you have said either to yourself or out loud things like this: I don't know how to share my faith, so I'm going to stay silent. Maybe you've said that. Or maybe you've said, I can't adequately answer anyone's questions, so I'll just not share. Or maybe you've said, I'm just going to live a good life, and I'll just wait for people to ask me about Jesus. And if you've said that out loud or said that to yourself, I just want you to know that Jesus wants you to have a paradigm shift today. As we've been going through this, we've been looking at what Jesus, not just what he said, but what he did. And as we've done that, I hope you realize that evangelism, sharing our faith, isn't necessarily a transaction, just like something we accomplish and check off on a box. It's not a debate, but it's also not a passive activity. As we've tried to look at the way Jesus evangelized, I would say evangelism Jesus style is like this. It's a sequence of actions that builds relationships that leads us to share our hope in Christ. It's a process that we're going to go through. And so we've been looking at that, and we've been talking about how that's going to help us to be a blessing. And so we've used the word bless as this acronym to talk about what that looks like. And so the first week we talked about that it begins with prayer. And we challenge you to identify, some people, maybe 8 people that are your neighbors, whether they live next to you or just people that you do life around, and begin praying for them. And saying, God, help me to be a blessing in their life so they might come to know you. And then last week, we talked about the next 2 actions, because they always go together, listening and eating. That's going to go together this week, amen? We're going to eat, we're going to share, we're going to visit with people. And it's talking about, just making use of a time we already have where we're always chewing food and swallowing it, to stop and look people in the eyes and see how they're doing. And we realize that when people are known and heard, that they feel loved. And it opens up this opportunity for us to talk about how God loves us. So this week we're going to move on and go to the next step, the first S, and it's this process of serving. Jesus served, and he's inviting us to do the same. We're going to jump several different places in the Gospels today. We're going to start in Matthew chapter 20, if you want to join me there, and then we'll be jumping to John, then we're going to jump back to Luke, so we're going to be around, or Mark, we're going to be around the Gospels today. But in Matthew chapter 20, verse 25, we see Jesus just right before he enters Jerusalem on the last week of his life. So this is just right before that week where he goes in and he gets the triumphal entry, and then it ends with him being crucified at the end of that week. Right before that, he's having a paradigm shift conversation with his disciples. And it goes like this, verse 25. Jesus called them over and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them. It must not be like that among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." And so they're about to enter Jerusalem. Passover festival's come in. They think something big's about to happen this week. And these guys, these disciples, these followers of Jesus are trying to figure out how they can get positions of power. Because you've probably heard the story, that James and John are wanting to know, hey, can we sit at your right hand, your left hand? And they're trying to figure out how to be important people. And Jesus says, don't be that way. That's not what my kingdom's about at all. And then he mentions 2 classes of people, servants and slaves. Servants were people who were under the employment of more well-to-do people, because they needed to make a living. And so they were the ones who did the work that nobody else wanted to do. They would hire themselves out for that. And then you had slaves, and they were even a little bit lower class, because they were what were called indentured servants. That meant that they weren't just doing a job and showing up, but they had sold their life to people because of economics or circumstances and said, my life is yours. They would get some economy out of it. They would get taken care of. But they didn't really have a choice at that point. They'd pretty much given their life over to serve because they didn't have any other way to live. And these were not what you hoped and dreamed for. This is not what you want your kids to grow up and be in these positions. And so Jesus mentions these, and then he does this paradigm shift. He, instead of saying that those are the lowest positions, he elevates those to the highest position. He says, that's how you be great. And he says, as a matter of fact, that's what I am doing for you. I came to serve, and I came to be a slave to many so they might know hope and love. So Jesus has this pep talk with them, and then he takes them on into Jerusalem, and they spend a really interesting week. And then if you want to turn over to John chapter 13, we're going to see at the end of that week, Jesus has one last meal. He has one sit down and eat and listen moment with the disciples. And in doing that, he changes their thinking even deeper. He says, I'm going to show you what it looks like to do what I said a few days ago, to be a servant. And so Jesus, who everyone thought was going to be the Messiah, who everyone thought was going to be the King of Kings, who was going to be this leader who came in and set things right, he took that crown off they expected and instead he picked up an apron. Let's read about this in John 13. It It says, before the Passover festival, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now, when it was time for supper, the devil had already put it in the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands, that he had come from God, and that he was going back to God. So he got up from supper, laid aside his outer clothing, and took a towel and tied it around himself. He ties this apron on. Next, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to dry them with a towel that was tied around him. Now, Jesus here sets an uncomfortable precedent for us to do something that's not comfortable. And in their culture, it was common to have your feet washed when you came into someone's house, because we talked about this a week or two ago, that your feet were dusty and dirty, and that was something that you would have done. But the host would never do that. The master of the house would never do that. He'd have a servant or a slave do that. As a matter of fact, he would usually have someone who was not a Jewish slave, but a non-Jewish slave do that, because it was such a nasty job that it would make you unclean. And the worst thing for a Jewish person to be was unclean, because then you couldn't go to temple and you couldn't worship and you couldn't have a relationship with God. So they didn't want to make Jewish people unclean, so they had to have non-Jewish people like mess with people's toenails. And Jewish people would never do that. Host would never do that. But Jesus, the Messiah, the King of Kings, what does he do? He stoops down and he cleans these guys' feet. And they were like, whoa, what is going on? Queen Elizabeth II passed away in September. Longest reigning monarch in modern history. Fantastic lady. All these great stories about her. And they can't prove that she actually said this, but it was often said of her that as the queen, she thought the whole world smelled like fresh paint. Because anytime the queen would come to visit your business or your house or your location, everyone would clean everything and put a fresh coat of paint on, because you want to put your best foot forward for the queen, right? So she just thought the whole world smelled like fresh paint, because that was the situation she always walked into. So imagine the queen was coming to your house today, and you had cleaned and you'd put on that fresh coat of paint and you had done everything you could to make things perfect, and she walked in and the first thing she did was went and started cleaning your bathroom. That would make you a little uncomfortable, wouldn't it? Matter of fact, you'd be like, stop, the queen cannot touch my toilet. Like you would be very uncomfortable. That's how these disciples felt, watching their master, their Savior, get down and put on this apron and wash their feet. But he does it because he needed to reveal to us not just a model, but a truth that we have to be made truly clean by Jesus. Let's read on here, verse 6. Then he came to Simon Peter, who asked him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I'm about to do you don't realize, but afterwards you will understand. You're never going to wash my feet, Peter said. Because again, he was uncomfortable. He didn't understand. But Jesus replied, if you don't wash, you have no part with me. So Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not only my feet, but my hands and my head. And see, Jesus is more than just a symbol. He was given a precursor to let them know that when he went to the cross the next day and died for them and died in their place, it was to make them clean. And that the only way that you're going to be made right, the only way you're going to be cleansed from your sins, the only way that you're going to be made right with God is because of what Jesus did, not because of what you're ever going to do. And he needed them to understand that and to trust him. And he needs us to understand that and to trust him. That I have to be served first by Christ before I can ever understand serving anyone else. I need to first be cleansed by Christ before I could ever tell someone else how to be cleansed. And so he sets this precedent for him. But then we get to this really interesting part of this, in verse 10. It says, one who has bathed, Jesus told Peter, doesn't need to wash anything except his feet, but he is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you, for he knew who would betray him. This is why he said to him, not all of you are clean. So Jesus takes off his crown, puts on an apron, gets down, washing dirty toenails. And guess whose feet he comes to and washes? Judas Iscariot, his betrayer. And guess what? Because he's God, he knew it. But he did it anyway, didn't he? And it's this really interesting example. As we think about how do we serve others, he says, you serve them all. And you can't control their response. We just follow that model of being servants to those around us and trust God for the outcome. And then he goes on and makes it clear to us what he's doing here. Verse 12, he says, when Jesus had washed their feet and put on his outer clothing, he reclined again and said to them, do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are speaking rightly, since that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. He says, so do what I have been doing. For I've given you example that you also should do just as I have done for you. Truly I tell you, a servant is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. And right there, Jesus brings this all together for us, right? He unveils our purpose. He says, I'm going to serve you, and I'm going to cleanse you by my sacrifice, and then I'm going to send you out as my messengers to tell other people, and by doing that, you're going to become what? A blessing. And that's what we've been talking about. Jesus gave us this model of how to bless others, and it's going to result in them coming to know him. So I imagine as Jesus washed their feet and was telling them these things, these guys, after they kind of got off the initial shock, they started thinking about that. And they're like, you know what, he's right. We have followed him around for 3 years. And what has he been doing? He's been serving people, and he serves people, and he serves people, and he serves people. And they started counting all of these times where he had done this. And I imagine one of them that came to their mind was the one we find in Mark chapter 7. If you want to turn there and follow along with me, I'm going to start in verse 31. In Mark chapter 7, we see Jesus once again coming across somebody in need and stopping and taking time and serving them. In my Bible, there at the beginning, right before verse 31, that the title head that someone added says, Jesus does everything well. You guys agree with that? Yeah, Jesus does everything well. So let's see why they say that he does everything well. It says, again, leaving the region of Tyre, he went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, through the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking and begged Jesus to lay hands on him. And so as we start thinking about exactly how Jesus served people, and we start trying to figure out how to do that ourselves, we have to see that Jesus served people who were in proximity to him. It says here, again, he went on this tour throughout the Judean countryside and going to all these cities that we don't want to pronounce the names of, and we might not know exactly where they're at. But if you knew where these ones are at that he's talking about, these were Greek-speaking towns. They weren't the ones that were the most popular or the most well-traveled, but he went everywhere he could to find people who needed help and need. And here he finds this man who needed healing. And for us, as we think about what that means for us, proximity might mean the person who lives next door to you. It might mean the person who works next to you or sits next to you at school or rides the bus with you. But it also might mean us looking around and saying, God, where are there people in need and I can go there? That's what Dennis and Nancy did. They asked God, where would you send us? And he took them all the way to Africa. That's why we do missions. That's why we talk about missions. That's why we invest in missions, because we need to go where people are in need. Maybe we look and we see, hey, in the jails, there's people who need healing and freedom, and they're in need. And so some of us in here go there. Maybe some of you have intentionally chosen your job. I know some of us have intentionally chosen jobs in education because we want to go because there's need and we want to invest in people. We've got a friend, his name is Dodie Buttram, which is a great name. And Dodie came out of a really rough life, and when he found the love of Jesus, he became one of the best evangelists I know. And Dodie told me one day, he's like, you know where everybody wants to hear about Jesus? At Casey's on Friday and Saturday night about 10 p.m. And so he goes to Casey's on Friday nights, and he finds people who want to talk about Jesus with Dodie. So we need to see where there are people in need in proximity to us and go there. And so then Jesus, when he finds this person, he interacts with him, and Jesus served this guy personally. Let's read this, verse 33. It says, so he took him away from the crowd in private, and after putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue. And this is so interesting. You might have missed this first part of that, because he did this, but he took the guy aside to private. And why would he do that? Very often when we see Jesus doing miracles and ministry, is out in public, there's big crowds around, and he's healing people and doing things, and people are losing their mind. But he takes this guy. Why would he take this guy aside? Well, it says the guy was deaf and he had a speech impediment. Anyone ever known someone with a speech impediment? Maybe some of you have one. And if you've ever had one or have one, you know that you're always noticing snickers and sideways glances whenever you try to talk. And this guy probably his whole life had been made fun of, been marginalized. And the worst thing if you have a speech impediment is for you to have to get up in front of people and say or do anything because you just don't want to be embarrassed again. And Jesus had compassion on this guy, and he knew this guy, and he loved this guy. And that's something we have to notice, that when Jesus washed his disciples' feet, why did he do that, it said? Because he loved them. And so if we're going to serve people, it's more than it's more than like us crossing off something and saying, I've been a good Jesus follower today. It's us learning to love people, getting down in the junk of their life and trying to help them. That's what Jesus did. And then lastly, he served powerfully. Let's read on here in verse 34. Looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, Epaphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak clearly. And a miracle happens. Jesus calls down power from heaven, and this guy can speak and talk, and it's a miracle. And we're amazed, and we're thankful, and we watch that, and we're like, man, go Jesus. And then as we remember that he told us to go and do the same thing, it may be a challenge for us, because how can I get somebody to speak and hear if they can't? Like, can I do that? Well, Jesus told his disciples after he washed their feet this in John 14, truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do. And he will do even greater works than these because I am going to the Father. Did you hear that? If we follow Jesus' example, he's going to use us to do greater things than he did. If we believe and if we trust. And if that's shocking to you, you're not alone. Because, you jump down to verse 37 here. It says, they, the crowd, were extremely what? Astonished. And said, he has done everything well. He even makes deaf hear and mute speak. And so these guys, they were astonished, not just that this guy could speak, but that Jesus, this guy that they thought was going to be this leader, was willing to step down and touch this unclean guy and take time with him and serve him. They were astonished. But see, they were expecting something else. They were looking for a political leader, and they got a suffering servant who calls us to go and follow his example. Which leads me to the next question of today. Jesus, when he did this, he had to take off his crown, and he had to put on an apron. And so for us today, as we think about this, if we're going to start following this example, if we're going to have this paradigm shift, and we're going to jump into this and serve people, what do I need to lay down so I can do what Jesus did? Maybe it's the desire to see immediate results. I think so often we want to see things happen now, but we have to see that this is a process. This is not a one-and-done thing. This is us consistently, daily, serving people and persevering even if they don't seem to get it. We choose to love others just like Jesus did, and sometimes that can take a lifetime. Maybe we need to put down our own desires, and I think that's really what he was calling these disciples to do, was to not have their own ideas or their own wants. Jesus actually even tells us that we should lay down our own rights, considering others better than ourselves so they might come to know Jesus. And maybe for a lot of us, what we got to put down today is our fear. Fear that we're not going to do it right. Fear that we're not going to know the right thing to say. Fear that someone's going to ridicule us or reject us. We need to put those things down and follow this suffering servant Messiah who calls us to do the same thing. So to help us do that, I want to close today with talking to you about a tool. So a couple weeks ago at our church business meeting, we adopted some strategic goals, which I'm going to talk more about after the first of the year. But these goals are these small, actionable steps that we want to encourage our attenders to do that are going to help us reach our mission and vision. And one of those goals is just simply this, that we would every day, that we'd wake up and we look around our life and say, God, where are there some people in need and how can I get involved? It's just simply asking that question, like, where's there some needs and how can I get involved in those? And Dave and John Ferguson, who are these brothers who are pastors who actually coined this BLESS acronym that we're going through, they suggest that we break that question down into some RPMs. Everybody know what an RPM is? Revolution per minute, right? That's what makes things turn. That's what makes an engine go, right? So, but they say RPMs in this are 4 things. We need to ask, how is my neighbor doing relationally? As we're praying for that person, that we can be a blessing to them, we ask that question, how's their home life, their marriage and their family? What do their relationships look like? Do they have any close friends? Do they get along with other people? And maybe as we ask those questions, it might be a moment for us to say, God, how can I be a friend to this person and be a good listener to whatever's going on in their life? We also ask, how's my neighbor doing physically? Do they have health concerns? Are they going to the doctor a lot? Are they exercising? Do they seem to eat healthy? Do they seem overall generally healthy? And as we answer that, maybe an opportunity for us to say, is there a way I can help them with some things they're not able to do? Is there a way I can invite them to do some healthy things with me that they're not already doing? We ask, thirdly, how's my neighbor doing mentally? Do they seem stressed? Do they complain of insomnia or anxiety or low energy? Have they been showing signs of mood swings or depression? And then the fourth thing we ask is, how's my neighbor doing spiritually? Do I know where their faith is? Are they open to spiritual conversation? Is there anything I could pray for them about? And I'll just say this. Over all the years of me, I've asked a lot of people over the years, can I pray with you? And people who believe all sorts of different things, going through all sorts of different things in all sorts of walks of life. I've only been turned down once in all the times. That probably hundreds of times I've asked people to pray. I've only had one person say, no, thank you. Almost everybody will let you pray for them. And that is a simple way we can start serving others, is going on their behalf and asking God for whatever's going on in their life. And so as we ask those questions and we start seeing what's going on in our neighbor's life, it's an opportunity for us to have some actionable service, right? If you know someone who's lonely, invite them into your life. This week's Thanksgiving, and I hope that all of you in here have somebody that you're going to celebrate with. But the reality is there's some people who don't have anybody to celebrate with. Maybe there's somebody you could invite into your celebration and serve them in that way. I've watched some of you bring food to people in crisis. I've watched people drive other people to doctor's appointments. I've watched people make it a habit to call and check on people just because they care. Watch people help others do their yard work. I've watched people just take time to stop and listen because people are relationally starved. And maybe one of the ways that you can serve people is by inviting them to serve alongside you. We do our once-a-month food distribution program, and it's been a real blessing. We've gotten to bless a lot of people and provide a lot of food, but the surprising blessing in that is all the relationships we form working alongside each other doing it. And it's been surprising to me, but there have been people who their first contact and their first time coming to church was to come serve at the food distribution before they ever thought about sitting in a service. And then we've watched some of those same people come and sit in service and get involved. Because when we serve together and have that purpose together, it changes things. So these acts of service are just like with Jesus and the disciples. They're to show we care and to show that we love. At my house, just about every morning right now, one of my children has a necklace that a friend gave them, and the clasp is very small, and they can't quite get it on like this. Like I can't get them on like this. My fingers don't work right. And so every day, this child comes down, and my wife puts this necklace on, one of the first actions of the day, right? Simple thing, but it's an act of service. It's a way to say, I love you, and I care, and I'm willing to do something extra that I don't have to do for you. And we, try to do that for all our kids. And we try to do that for people in our life. And really, for our own kids, we hope that they will see the way we serve and that they'll come around to learning to serve others in the same way. But the reality is mostly we do it because we love them and because we want to see them to see the love of Jesus through us. And that's what Jesus is calling us to do. Next week we're going to talk about our story. And ultimately, all these steps have got to lead to a point where we tell somebody why we're doing these things and why we love them and that God loves them. We're going to get there. Next week, we'll wrap this up talking about that. But this week, I want you to ask this question. Who does God want me to serve? I read a story recently about a lady named Nellie, and her grandkids call her Gigi, which I don't know why, but Nellie and Gigi, those are far apart. But anyway, so Gigi is this 85-year-old grandma. And the way she answered this question, who you need to serve, was she had a neighbor across the street that she started praying for. And eventually she started getting together with her and meeting and eating and listening and doing these steps. And in doing that, Gigi found out that this neighbor had some health concerns. And there's some things that she couldn't do for herself. And one thing she couldn't do for herself was clip her toenails. And because of the health issues she had to take care of her feet. And so Gigi said, you know what? I can take care of your feet. This lady was younger than Gigi. Gigi's an 85-year-old lady. But once a week, Gigi walked across the street and clipped her neighbor's toenails. Why did she do that? Because Jesus had served her and loved her and called her to do the same for others. And in doing that, she gave this woman care and value and compassion and dignity that she couldn't have on her own. God's calling us to do the same things, to look around us and powerfully and personally do everyday, ordinary things in service to those around us. Now, to do that, it's going to take some courage and work and probably a shift in thinking. But I know this to be true, that it's always better to be involved on the court than to sit on the sidelines. Would you guys stand with me today?